Hey, Church of KAL, hope you all are doing well. Tis the season. It is. Christmas is fast, quickly approaching, and as we kind of pick up where we left off, Revelation chapter 9 is not only a spooky chapter, it is a bit eerie, and I just can't help but wanting to share some thoughts on Christmas before jumping into this somewhat gloomy chapter of how God will be wrapping things up. And so I wanted to read a familiar passage to you because, as you know, it is Advent season, and some of these verses might be so familiar to us that sometimes they might lose their punch. But in light of what's taking place in the book of Revelation here, let's remember that God is in control. In fact, when we run across some of these angels at the end of this chapter, it's like they're prepared for the year, the month, the day, the hour. It leaves no room for one to think that things were completely out of control, that it's chaotic, but that God is in control. So with that in mind, remember the words of Isaiah chapter 9, 6 and 7, familiar, but the heart of God. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. The government will be upon his shoulders. He's in charge. And his name will be called. And I love to stop here because sometimes we just kind of run through these and put them together. His name shall be called Wonderful Counselor. No, his name shall be called Wonderful. Let's just stop for a moment. Give praise to God that he's wonderful. He's wonderful Counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. I don't know if you've watched this week's Middle East update, but once again, him being in control, his title is that he is Prince of Peace. And of the increase of his government and peace shall be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it, establish it with judgment and justice. That's probably our segue into the book of Revelation. God is just and God will judge. But despite the gloom and doom, the thread that even runs through this chapter, as weird as it may sound, is the heart of God to extend the opportunity, still a lifeline, even in the midst of all of this, a lifeline of grace, if only they would cry out. So, Merry Christmas. And let's jump in to this week's lesson, Revelation chapter 9. And I want you to remember the haunting words of last week. At the end of last week, in chapter 8, we read, "As I watched, I heard an eagle that was flying in the midst, calling out in a loud voice, 'Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, because of the trumpet blasts that are about to be sounded by the other three angels.'" I think we ended last week by saying, I remember the song, "You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet." And that's what, as I was reading that, that's what came to my mind, is that these first four trumpets dealt with the environment, natural catastrophes in a sense, But this angel's saying you ain't seen nothing yet, because now it's spooky stuff. Now we're going to get into the supernatural aspects of God's judgment. And, you know, throughout the Bible, keep in mind, there have been supernatural armies that have previously appeared in the scriptures. It's almost like tearing back the veil and looking into the spiritual domain. We know that, again, remember Elijah is taken up in chariots of fire. We remember the story of Elisha's servant, where Elisha says, oh, God, just show him. And it's almost he's given the ability to see the curtain pulled back and the supernatural armies that are there. It's the same here in this chapter. Supernatural aspects, weird stuff. So let's jump in. Chapter 9. Then the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to the earth. And to him was given the key to the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke arose out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. Okay, a star fallen from heaven. Where have we heard that before? In Luke, when the 70 come back rejoicing about the miracles that they experienced, the power of the name of Jesus, Jesus said, and he said to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I wonder if this is an allusion to that. And then notice where it says, I saw a star fallen, and to him is given. So this star is not one of the planets, in a sense, the luminaries, but a personage. And again, when we read about Satan's fall, Lucifer, in Isaiah 14:12, we read, for you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven, and I'll exalt myself, or I'll put my throne above all the stars of God. I think this is a snapshot of Satan being expelled. Now he's, again, the timetable is all in God's hands, but he's given this key to the bottomless pit. It's referred to in the Old Testament as the abuso, bottomless pit, 9 times in the New Testament, 30 times in the Old Testament, 7 times in the book of Revelation. And about this abuso, in Genesis 6 and in 2 Peter 2 and Jude 6 as well, we read that angels, fallen angels that have sinned, have been incarcerated in this place called the abuso. In Luke chapter 8, where we read about the swine and the Gadarenes, we read that the demons begged Jesus that they might avoid the abuso. Luke 8:31. And we're told ultimately, before everything's finished, when Satan is confined and imprisoned in Revelation 20, before he's released in the millennium, we'll get to that later, we're told that he'll be imprisoned in the abuso. So, bottomless pit, shaft. Some believe that this is actually the center of the earth, that because it's the only way that you can have a bottomless pit where everything is up, right? Not sure if this is, and I should say this to begin with, throughout this chapter, we've got a first century man trying to explain 20 centuries later things that he's witnessing and seeing. He doesn't have the context, and so oftentimes he'll say, and it was like this. And so in regards to some of these things, I don't know whether to be literal or if this is figurative, and I'll just give you my thoughts as we go. Okay, continuing on. So the sun and the air were darkened once this abuso was opened because of the smoke of the pit. And then out of the smoke, locusts came upon the earth. And to them was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. And they were commanded not to harm the grass of the earth, or any green thing, or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. I said it's spooky stuff. And so now we have something like these locusts that have the ability to have something as strong, if not worse, than a scorpion sting. And they're set free to wreak havoc on the inhabitants of the earth. The only people that are kept from this are those that have the seal of God on their foreheads. And we know that in chapters earlier are what? 144,000 Jewish evangelists, in a sense. Something about this sting, well, let's move on, and then I'll talk about that. These locusts, these things that have come out, it says that they were not given the authority to kill the people, kill them, but to torment them for 5 months. Their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it strikes a man. And in those days, men will seek death, not find it. They will desire to die, and death will flee from them. You know, as I was preparing for this lesson, I came across the story of in the times of the Roman Empire, where you had sort of the elite Romans, sort of like our SEAL teams of today. And part of their training was that their commander was allowed at any time to, at night, jab them with a knife in the thigh or an arrow in the stomach region in order to make sure that they did not cry out in pain that would allow an enemy to know where they're at. And as the story goes, while these troops were in Africa, in northern Africa, they had these scorpions that were there, and so the ability for them to handle the pain of a knife or an arrow, when these same soldiers were struck or stung, I guess you would say, by a scorpion, they were able to quelch their screaming for only minutes before the pain was so intense that they no longer could hold it in. And so, as I said before, this is judgment of God. He's wrapping things up. And yet, even in the midst of this, and one of our study questions tonight is going to be, is there any thread of grace through a chapter like this? And it's almost as if God is giving a preview of what hell is going to be like. And the lifeline here may not seem like a great lifeline, but these beings are allowed to torment, but notice, not to kill. In those days, men will seek death and they will not be able to find it. They'll desire to die, but death will flee from them. Is that a thread of grace? No. You have to understand what's still yet to come. If only you would turn. And then we're told that there's a specific time here, 5 months, 150 days. I don't know what to make out of this other than just to note that it may be symbolic of a period of judgment, because in Genesis 7:24 we read about the flood of Noah being 150 days as well. Well, Let's continue on. Verse 7 says, okay, now John is going to try to describe them. He says the shape of the locust was like, and here that's important to note, it's not literal. This first century guy, and we might be the same way when we see this supernatural enemy, we're just trying to describe it. It was like this. So I don't think these are Black Hawk helicopters or the tanks, the Merkavas of Israel. I don't think that these are today's modern day weaponry. I think that these are supernatural entities, and John describes them by saying they were like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were crowns of something like gold. Their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like women's hair. Their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots with many horses running into battle. And they had tails like scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men for 5 months. Now, it's interesting that even natural locusts have this sort of eerie appearance of horses equipped with armor. In fact, both the German and the Italian terms for a locust have to do with little horses. And then we're told that they have the teeth of lions. We see that in Joel 1:6, and even the sound of natural locusts that are swarming is terrifying. But keep in mind, these are demonic creatures. Now, I've given you some, I usually don't do this, but in the PDF that you're sent, as I'm scrolling through, I'm trying to give you a description of what John might have seen. So there's some sort of weird pictures here of what this might have looked like to John. And now we come to verse 11, and we read that these locusts, it says, and they had a king over them, the angel of the bottomless pit, this guy that was given the key, whose name is in Hebrew Abaddon, and in Greek he has the name Apollyon. And then we're told one woe is past. Behold, still 2 more woes are coming. Meditate. Remember what that meant? After these things. Well, we know that again, these are demonic creatures. Proverbs 20 verse 37 is a weird little statement, but it's God in a sense saying, keep this in mind, file it away. And Solomon writes that the locusts have no king. And even to this day, it is hard for scientists and scholars to explain these swarms that are going on, because there's no one leader that's doing it, and they all seem to move in the same direction at the same time. Sometimes you see this with flocks of birds as well. But again, these have a king. And we're told that his name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek it's Apollyon. This means destroyer, destruction. And again, I've given you in the PowerPoint the biblical references to these 6 times in the Old Testament, Job, Psalms, Proverbs. You can look at those. Take the time to look up those references. And then Apollyon, that's the Greek destroyer, John 10:10. There's allusion still to this prince of the air, destroyer, Apollyon, and again, Ephesians, John, and Isaiah point that out as well. Again, you've got the PowerPoint, so you can follow up on that. And then we hit verse 13. Then the next angel, the sixth angel, sounded, and I heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. The golden altar in the tabernacle sat right outside of the Holy of Holies. This was an altar of incense, but also blood on Yom Kippur was sprinkled on this altar. We read about the avenger of blood, and Jesus is the ultimate avenger of blood, coming forth from the horns of the altar. And so, again, I stated in the very beginning, God, grace, mercy, just, and judgment. And we're coming to just and judgment. The voices of the martyrs. God is saying, hold on, it's coming. Judgment. And so now we see, again, as we said in the beginning, this is weird stuff. We now have four angels that are going to be released, that are going to be given the power to kill mankind, or a percentage of mankind. But before we get to that, let's take a look at, it says that they're bound at the great river Euphrates. Currently, they're bound there. And now as we go to the biblical maps in our minds, we think of Babylon because we think of what took place. Sin began here. Many believe that the Garden of Eden, those rivers that were given of location, were only given two of them, but Tigris, Euphrates, it's going to be in that sort of area, so that we know in this geographical area, sin began here. Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. We know in Genesis 4:8 that the first murder took place here. We know from Genesis 10 and 11 that Nimrod, that mighty warrior, that rebellious warrior, that basically made the statement, we will rebel. And again, we have obviously the Tower of Babel in this area as well, being the fountainhead of idolatry and false worship. And so these spiritual entities that are bound in this area are now released. And so verse 15 says about these four angels that they have been prepared for the hour and the day and the month and the year, and they were released to kill a third of mankind. Now the number of the army of the horsemen apparently that they're leading was 200 million. And I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision. Those who sat on them had breastplates of fiery red, jacinth blue, sulfur yellow, and the heads of the horses were like the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire, smoke, and brimstone. Before I show you the next picture on the slide, note God is in control. These angels have been prepared for what? The hour, the day, the month, and the year. Apparently these are wicked angels because they've been bound and they must be loosed. And because of what's already taken place, Revelation 6:8, we know that a fourth of mankind has been killed. Their ability to kill a third means that now over half the world's population is dead by the time the sixth trumpet is completed. Keep in mind, we don't know even the number of those that are taken out at the rapture, but the population of this earth is decimated. Okay, so next slide's just again some images of what these angels and their army may have looked